It's all just some fun in the sun until the beach is filled with zombies. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lexton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today I have a review of Dead of Summer by Ryan La Sala. This is being published the 16th of September, and it is being published by Scholastic, and I was given a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. This is a YA horror story that takes place on an island that is like a summer vacation island, right? Think of a mix between, Provincetown and Fire Island. So it's this very gay summer vacation destination. And our main character, Ollie, he's returning to the island with his mom. He is a local, one of the few members of the community that live there all the time. And he and his mother run a B&B. But she had a health scare, a pretty significant health scare, and he left the island almost a year ago, and now they're coming back, and that's how the story starts. And then you get to the island, and for lack of a better term, there is a zombie outbreak, and that is like the thrust of the story. And now, before I get too far into my review, I have to say that, this story is marketed as a teen and YA horror story. And when you say YA, young adult, there's a whole spectrum of what that can mean. But this really is very young for young adult. At least it felt that way to me. And one of the problems I had with this story is the characters are all in their senior year of high school, or they just finished their senior year of high school. It's the summer after their senior year of high school, except for one of them, who I think a character they meet who is a freshman in college. So they're all like 18, 19 years old. They don't read that way at all. They read more like 14, 15-year-olds. And they act really young. The way they treat adults, the way they treat each other, the way they like engage in problem solving, everything they do feels really, really young. And if this story had them aged as having just finished 8th grade and about to start high school instead of about to start college, it would make a lot more sense. And so pretty much I re-aged them in my own mind when reading the story, and that made the story make a lot more sense to me. If I really took them at face value as being 18, then a lot of their actions seemed kind of ridiculous and childish, and it made the story like unbelievable. I mean, not the zombie part. The zombie part was always believable. That's great. But just like their actions and their like interior motivations felt very young to me. And so I think that's useful to know going in, that this really feels, it puts the Y in YA in very much. It's not middle grade at all, but it definitely puts the Y in YA. And for me personally, this story doesn't hit in my sweet spot. Like, YA horror isn't my favorite type of horror, but when it hits well, I really enjoy it. But this is aimed at an audience that's a little bit below what I'm usually interested in. And what I mean by that is it takes some really interesting ideas and big topics, and it distills them into really simple explanations of them. It doesn't go into like an interior or psychological depth that I really would have wanted it to, considering the heaviness of some of the topics that are explored, which include grief and loss and trauma and, the death of a parent or the sickness of a parent, a whole island that is potentially being poisoned, the dangers of capitalism. Like, all of these other things are mixed together, and they're presented in a way that is just very simple, and it's appealing for a younger audience, but really, an early teen audience. And so if you re-age all the characters to be 14, 15 instead of being 18, 19, then this story is a lot of fun. So as I said, you get to this island and there is a zombie outbreak, and your main character, Ollie, and his group of friends have to survive, essentially. Almost everyone in the story is queer. I will say it feels almost ornamental, which I go back and forth all the time of what it means to have a queer story. So there's so many queer characters in this story, and they're on this like queer Mecca island. And so as a result of that, there's no discrimination. They're not feeling like they're being ostracized or there's any social pushback because everyone's queer. But as a result of that, it doesn't really feel like a queer story. There's a little bit of a hint of romance maybe, and I think there's one kiss that happens throughout the whole story. But other than that, there is nothing particularly queer about the story, other than that the fact that you're told the characters are queer, and there is one character who is a drag queen who is in their drag persona for a good part of the story. And I mean, I don't know. For me, if you're gonna identify something as a queer story, I'd like it to feel queer. And here you don't feel it. It just feels like a story that happens to be about young kids who are running around trying to save their island from zombies. And the fact that they happen to be queer is entirely incidental or ornamental to the story. But maybe that's what people are looking for. Maybe that kind of queer utopia, that kind of unquestioned acceptance is useful. Especially, like I said, if you're looking at a story that's aimed at 14-year-olds or 13, 14, 15-year-olds, then I think it is useful. So again, that is a little bit of a sticking point for me. Okay, so getting over those hurdles, let's talk about the story itself, because I think the writing is really good. First off, let's talk about the zombies. Because if you're going to have a zombie story, what are the zombies? You're on a small island, and of course, these zombies, as you saw on the cover, and I'll put another picture of it up, they are like made of coral. They're made of sea life. They are wild. They're visceral. They are gross. And I think the zombies are really, really well depicted. I really enjoyed them. And the action scenes that happen are really smart, and they're effective. They take your breath away. So I think that has a lot going for it in that regard. The writing, is smart, it's descriptive, it's pretty fast paced. And what he does, which is really smart, is it goes back and forth in time. And so when you start, you have one of the main characters is basically imprisoned on a military ship that is off the coast of this island after the events of the outbreak. And you read transcripts from a doctor or a scientist who is interviewing them. And it goes back and forth between these transcripts and then what happened. And so it goes 3 days after the outbreak, 3 days before the outbreak, and so forth. You're going back and forth in time. And I think this works well. Using transcripts like that, it's always a stylistic gamble, because what happens is you sacrifice character interiority in order to give more exposition. And I will say that it is a little hard to believe that like the scientists in this case actually like would write down all of these things and would remember it all, and so sometimes like what you get in transcripts and found media in this way, it's hard to believe. And it is hard to believe here. It's very convenient. It's very easy. But at the same time, it works for the story, and it really builds tension. And going back and forth between these transcripts and what happened, a retrospective look at the events and then living the events, it creates, tension in a really smart way. So it cuts the action and it cuts the fast-paced nature of the story in a way that I think that just plot-wise, it works really well. And it also allows there to be time jumps in the narrative. So when you're on the main action of the story and then you cut to a transcript, when you come back, it could be a day later or something like this. And it allows for a more seamless flow for the narrative. So the writing itself, I think, is smart. I think it's well done. And not only does it really help the pacing, but this back and forth adds a sense of intrigue and paranoia, which I think is useful for the world building. Because look, the setup for this story, it isn't entirely original. You have some sort of zombie-like outbreak. They're not actual zombies, but they're like zombies. So you have a zombie-like outbreak in an isolated place that is complete with untrustworthy scientists and untrustworthy government agents. And there is some, mysterious or messy history to this place that you're trying to uncover that is probably the cause of these zombies, but you don't really know. And there are some people who are trying to exploit the zombie plague, others who are just trying to survive it. And this is all set against like the personal apocalypse of our main character, right? Because their life, his life, and Ollie's life is like in turmoil. And so you have this external craziness happening against the backdrop of inner turmoil. Like that isn't new, right? That's how zombie stories usually go. And yet he puts it in a very clever location, being on a beach with these like coral zombies. I think is really smart. And it's enough of a change to feel fresh, right? To give you something new. The way the zombies are depicted feels new. And it does give you an opportunity to really spend time with Ollie, And I think the time you spent with Ollie is good. I think he as a character is really interesting. He's complicated. He's messy. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He feels lost. He's making mistakes. He already made mistakes that he's trying to make up for now. I think all that is really smart. I think the ancillary characters, his friend group, and then the antagonists, there are human antagonists as well, as you can imagine. Like I said, there's these untrustworthy scientists and untrustworthy government types walking around. They all feel really convenient. Now, they are interesting, they're colorful, they are like complicated in some ways, and you sense that they have these whole personal histories and life stories to them, especially his friend group, but you don't really get to know their interior lives. And the story is all from the point of view of the main character, so we only get to see them through his experience of them, right? So we're limited as a reader to what we know about them, but they do just feel a little bit convenient. They feel more like part of the set pieces or part of the background than active players in this like psychodrama, if that makes sense. So that's unfortunate. I would have liked more time with the ancillary characters. But for me, this again goes to the point of, if you are aimed at a younger audience of 13, 14, 15, having a diverse array of characters that feel genuine, like they don't feel fake. They just, they feel convenient for the narrative. But if you have this diversity and they are working with the main character and you spend all of your time in the main character and you use this somewhat, expected formula of a zombie outbreak in an isolated community with untrustworthy adults. That gives you a chance to see how all of these things bounce off of your main character and allows you to focus on like the hurricane that is at the heart of your main character. Because that main character is in the middle of this whirlwind of emotions, right? He is unstable and he doesn't know what he's doing, and that all works for the story. It makes the story itself more believable. It makes the writing and the plotting and the decision making more effective because you see how no one knows what they're doing. Everyone is out of their depth. What I like too is the way the story ends. Now, I will say that this is, at least on the art copy, it's listed as book 1, and you kind of know at the end that it's setting up for another book. It is a complete story, but it also is setting up for more story, if that makes sense. So with that said, where it ends I think is good, and I definitely appreciated about it is that the ending makes sense. Like, it doesn't seem like a lot of time what happens in kind of survival stories, especially stories with young children, is that they, again, they're not really young children, they're 18-year-old, but they feel like young children. They develop essentially superpowers, right? Like, in order to resolve the story at the end, it goes places that totally come out of the blue that seem unexpected. That's not the case here. The way the story ends, the way they resolve things, is perfectly in line with the characters as they have been set up right from the beginning. And, you know, there are like convenient plot things that happen that allow them to be in positions to then bring the ending about. Yeah, sure. But that's how narrative works. None of it feels unrealistic given the circumstances, given the world building. And so I appreciate that even in this wildly fantastical world with these really creative and ingenious zombies that really work well for this environment, you have these characters that feel like where they end up makes sense from where they began. Like, everything is moving in a logical way. So you never are pulled out of the story by saying, oh, that can't be real, right? So that I think is really effective. I think he does it really well. I think he looks at the character's strengths and their weaknesses, and he doesn't try to make them overpowered or superpowered. He leans into the fact that they are imperfect, and that is how they then discover how to, you know, defeat the zombies or whatever, you know, the case may be at the end of the story. Look, I think this story feels really honest. It feels really emotional. It feels really heartfelt, and it gives you a chance to explore grief and loss in a way that feels genuine. And that is kind of what I'm hoping for in a story like this. I will say the human antagonist kind of felt like a cartoon character. Like, they didn't feel fully realized. And the mystery of the island, which isn't fully explained in this story, I think that's part of what's going to happen in the next story. Like, the mystery of the island, it feels like the least thoughtful part of the story. And that might be because a lot of that is going to be explained more in a subsequent novel. But that aspect of it didn't work for me all that well. And you needed it. You needed to have the secondary antagonist. So it's not just the zombies, but where do the zombies come from? Are they going to be weaponized? Like, who is trying to control them? Who is creating them? All these things. You know, what is being done to this island, to this community that has caused this to happen? Is this new, or is this something that's been going on for decades? Like, those are questions that are important to the story, but the main antagonist we get as a villain, a human antagonist that is, they just feel over the top, and their actions feel, again, this feels like it's written from the point of view of a young person who is looking at the adult and just sees like an overinflated sense of the adult, right? You know what I mean? Like a cartoony villain in many ways. So I think that could have used some work, unfortunately. But I did like the main character, and I like the way they related to things. And I think that the world building is really smart and effective. I think the vulnerability and the authenticity in the story reads really clearly, and it's all packaged up in a really creative way. So I think it was memorable. I think it was a fun summer thrill ride. I enjoyed the story. Again, it's not I'm not the target demographic for this kind of story, but I think if you do like YA horror, and if you like queer horror that doesn't really talk about queerness, but just assumes everyone's queer and is okay with it, if you like that kind of world building, I think there is some fun to be had here. Especially, you know, I've looked at other reviews of this, I will say, and I'm a little bit in the minority. And I think that, you know, a lot of people went into this having read Ryan La Sala's other work, like The Honeys, really loved it and really loving him, and just being wide open to taking whatever he gives and really loving it. And so a lot of the other reviews I've read are much more positive than mine. Mine is much more balanced. I think it's a good story. I think the plotting is well done. I think the writing is tight and descriptive. I think going back and forth between transcripts and events in the future that are retrospective and then the present moment of the action, I think that's really smart. I think all of that works together well. I think the characters are a little bit shallow. The characters could use more depth. They could be more interesting. They're colorful, right? They're dynamic. They add to the landscape, but they don't have a lot going on the inside. They're presented in such a way that you believe that they do have deep emotional interior lives, but you just don't have any experience of it. You're just told that, right? So the characters could use some work, and the themes that are being explored about friendship, about love, about family, about grief, about loss, about trust and community. I think all that is interesting. I think he does interesting things with it. None of it is wildly unexpected, but it's still fun. It still feels competent. And if that is your vibe, then I think you're going to have a good time with it. I also just really appreciate zombies out in the sunshine, zombies on the beach. I think is a creative and interesting take on the zombie genre. I think that's all I probably have to say about this. I mean, I'm not the target demographic yet. I still enjoyed it. I think if you enjoy YA horror, if you enjoy zombie horror or survival horror, all those things, if they're appealing to you, then I think you'll enjoy this book as well. I'd love to hear, have you read Ryan La Sala's other work? Does it have that same vibe of being really young adult, or is it a little older? My impression was that it was more aged up young adult, teetering into new adult category. But that was just my impression. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this book or about his other work down below in the comments. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves. Take care of each other and go slowly.